Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading from the One Year Bible, and we examine some questions that extend our learning from the Sermon on Sunday. Today I'm joined by Sheryl Daughety and Wendy Korbusieski, and we're looking at a passage from Genesis 32, verses 1 through 12. So let me read a couple of those verses. Verse 1 says, "As Jacob started on his way again, angels of God came to meet him. And when Jacob saw them, he exclaimed, 'This is God's camp.' So he named the place Mahanaim." Is that right?
Mahanaim.
Mahanaim. Okay, got it. Verse 6 then goes on to say, "After delivering the message, the messengers returned to Jacob and reported, 'We met your brother Esau, and he is already on his way to meet you with an army of 400 men.' Jacob was terrified at the news, and he divided his household along with the flocks and herds and camels into two groups." So, Cheryl, give us a little bit of context to help us understand what has happened in the life of Jacob and Esau up until this point.
So they're twins, and I guess technically Esau is the oldest one. And their relationship has been strained since the beginning. They're very different. One is the mother's favorite.
And one is the father's favorite.
One is the father's favorite. Yeah, they're always kind of busier fighting against each other than they are for each other. And so Jacob, the younger twin, tricks Esau out of his birthright, basically. And then later, he tricks the father out of Esau's blessing. And, just causes a horrible feud that up until this point really hasn't been reconciled because Jacob flees. He's afraid for his life. And so he does flee. He actually goes and becomes pretty wealthy, and, he's got lots of family and children, and his flocks are huge. And so at this point, he's afraid when he hears that Esau's headed his way with these 400 men, because he thinks he's come after me and I'm going down and everybody's going down with me.
Well, when they parted ways, when he fled, when he left, there was tension there. He left because his mama sent him. He said he was coming after him. I'm going to kill you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he's pretty sure that's what his brother's come to do, is make good on his word.
Wendy, we've been discussing the theme of praying for influence this week. So how does this text connect with that theme?
One of the most difficult groups to gain influence with is your family. That's a sermon all in itself right there. A lot of times you got broken relationships to contend with, for whatever. Could be a multitude of reasons. And then there's reconciliations, broken relationships with that. So there's influence that needs to happen there. And one of the interesting things around this text is that the title that Jacob gives to this place is called Mahanaim, which means two camps. And Jacob began to enter the land of Canaan. He was met by a camp of angels, and that's why he called his camp and the camp of angels two camps. So that we had the two camps there. But when he found out that Esau was coming to meet him with an army of 400, he naturally assumed the worst because of that broken relationship, but how he left things broken. And I'm assuming the lack of influence or fear that he had of how things got left unresolved there. And so he was afraid for the worst. And so he, in turn, also took his family, because it was huge at that point. 2 wives, all these kids, all these flocks that he had accumulated while he was away. And he broke his family into 2 camps. And so that's where we are. He's hoping that if something had happened and his Esau attacked, that at least one of those would be able to escape. A part of his family would be able to survive. So that's where we are. So what do we learn from this text about praying for influence and reconciliation?
I think we have to understand that God is involved in matters of reconciliation. So since I've been pastor here, the only sermon that I think I have ever preached twice that was identical. I have preached another one that was really, really close to the same. But the only one I've preached twice that I preached exactly the same outline, almost no tweaks, was one about this story. And the dividing of camps. Jacob keeps Joseph with him. His mama had a favorite. His daddy had a favorite. He had a favorite. You know, and Joseph is really small. And I preached it both times on Baby Dedication Sunday. And I talked about what Joseph learned, that his ability to reconcile with his brothers was built upon him watching Esau, because it was Esau that offers the peace. It wasn't Jacob. Jacob becomes the one that is the father of the Israelites, but it was Esau that offers to the peace.
But he learned the lesson that day.
But Joseph learned the lesson, you know, by watching it. That was an influence thing, right? That was happening. And you know, Sunday I talked about, in the sermon on influence, I talked about the difference between power and influence. And one of the examples that I gave is of parenting. So at a parenting level, when kids are young, you have a power position, right? If you tell a kid that's living in your house, you have to go to church, or you've got to wear these clothes, or you've got to do whatever, they have to do it because you have the power. But the older they get, the less power you have, and the more you have to rely on influence. And if you've only developed a power mentality with your kids, when they get older, you have no influence. But if you learn, okay, the most important thing here is that I need to be able to influence them, not force them to do what they need to do, it changes the dynamics. I think a lot of times we're facing reconciliation in broken relationships. The Jewish rabbis, they explain the theological meaning of the camp of angels there, that it symbolizes God's protection over Jacob. But the second thing is, even when we know God's involved in reconciliation, we can still experience fear and uncertainty. Some of his problem is his own unresolved guilt, because there is rarely, I don't like the word never. This is a place I think I could use it, but I'm going to just stick with rarely. Rarely is there a need for reconciliation that is only one-sided. Sometimes I'll deal with marriage and couples, and one of them will have committed a horrible offense. But there are often a lot of things that lead up to that. And getting the other side to acknowledge, right, that they played any role in how they ended up at this place is very difficult, because you have this egregious sin. But rarely is it just, what I would say, let's use adultery, for example. Rarely, I can't think of a case where this has been true, that somebody had this perfect marriage, and then somebody
boom,
cheated on them, right? There were other extenuating circumstances. So we have some unresolved guilt on our part that makes it difficult for us to reconcile. And I think he is uncertain, right? How is it going to be received? That's the other piece. Even when we resolved our guilt, I can think of a situation in my life right now that I would love to figure out a way to offer a olive branch to somebody, but I don't know how it's going to be received, right? I just don't know. I don't know how it's going to land, and there is a certain fear that comes along with that. So, Cheryl, have you ever had to navigate a difficult reconciliation, and if so, how did God? How was He involved in it?
I think that the biggest, in hindsight, way, I think I now know and knew at the time that God was in the middle of all of it, was that He helped me hold my tongue and not say things that would have hurt so badly that it would have kept us from being able to reconcile with each other, whether we ever did or not.
Right.
And I think it probably helped. He helped me be more patient and try to see it from that person's point of view too, and also to think more long term of like, okay, well, I'm super hurt about this right now, but how should it play out in the long run? What's the bigger picture here than wanting to be right or be justified,
or them to see my point.
Right.
Yeah. It's not about winning.
Yes.
What is the win?
So, go ahead.
No, yeah.
Yeah, because if it's you being right, that's not reconciliation.
Right, that's right. Somebody said to me recently they were surprised. Well, I the example that you talk about holding your tongue. The example that's easy for me to give because it's kind of played out now over time, and it's enough distance I can say what I want to about it.
Which is not holding your tongue.
Right. When I became pastor here, there were 200 and some people in the business meeting that night. We have never had anything approaching that in a business meeting. And there was a large group of people who didn't vote for me to be pastor, and many of them walked out and, throwing bombs. And we made the choice, okay, we're not going public to talk about how we got to this point. We're not going to talk about those people. And over the last 15 years, a large percentage, not all, but a large percentage of those people have made their way back to the church. Had we chosen to pull out the guns and just start shooting, because we could have justified what had happened and how it came about. If we had done that, it would have been much more difficult for them to come back. Almost impossible, right? Yeah. But because we didn't do that, we left the door open. And I think that is the key, is when those estrangements happen, that we try to leave the door open. But what happens when reconciliation doesn't happen? What do you do?
It's down to two choices. I mean, you really have two options. You can either be bitter, or you can make a decision to pray specifically for that person or that situation for betterment. Whatever that situation is, pray for the good of that person or that situation, to be blessed. Wherever that is, regardless or not whether they want good for me outside of that, to let it go, because at the end of the day, that's not the poison I want to drink.
Yeah.
Forget
what is it
that.
They say about bitterness and hate and those kind of things? It's like drinking poison
and expecting them to die. Yeah. No thanks. It's like worrying. You why worry? Because you're going to, if it does come to pass, then you just suffered twice.
You can't control it anyway.
Right. If it does come to pass, you've just suffered twice because you worried about it and suffered, and then it happened and you suffered. Why am I going to be? Those are your two options. So I'm going to, if they're not willing to reconcile.
But you did what you could.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, don't.
And the timing of that has to be right.
Right.
The situation I was talking about earlier, it may be a matter of timing, for me, because there are occasions that I think, I would like to, how would this be received? And I just don't know. And so I think Jacob's fear is tied to his his own personal past mistakes, right? I wish I'd have done things differently.
Right.
And we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
How does unresolved guilt or shame affect our ability to trust God's protection when we're seeking to reconcile those relationships?
And I think that all goes back when you're thinking about Jacob, and he's afraid because of his own shame and his guilt about how Esau is going to receive him, and your situation, you don't know how it's going to be received. I think a lot of times we don't give people the benefit of the doubt. And I think if it's on our heart to reconcile, that we've just got to put it out there. And where it lands is where it lands. And then I think you've done what you've been told to do. Then it's on the other party. And a lot of times, I think, especially in Jacob's situation here, and when we feel like we can't advance in a situation of reconciliation, is because we can't forgive ourselves. Like, how could that person ever reconcile with me when I can't even find the forgiveness in myself? But that's how a lot of times we see sin in general. You know, how can I receive that grace when, you know, I don't think I deserve it? But Mark Pettis talked about it, that scripture this morning, and I thought, man, that hits today. I mean, that's exactly what because you know what? You don't deserve it. But Christ gave it to you anyway.
Yeah. And I think on the other side of that, if you can't admit the part that you played in it, or your guilt or your sin, or, you know, whatever you did have to do with that situation, then it is really difficult for you to offer that olive branch, or even if you haven't taken it to God and asked for forgiveness there and then said, hey, how can I reconcile this? Help me through this situation. Then it is really hard for you to move forward in any of it, because, I mean, gosh, and in, you know, Jacob and Esau's situation, of course, Esau had perpetuated some of it, but he ultimately was the one who did offer the olive branch. And maybe it was because he could admit his guilt after time had gone on and said, okay, I want to see this situation resolved. I want this relationship with my brother healed, and took the step, but he didn't know how Jacob was going to receive that, you know?
I'm semi-scared to tell this story. and we got to wind down for today. But when I went through a divorce, it went against everything my dad believed. I mean, everything he believed. And it was tough. I mean, it was really, our relationship was tough. And at the time, they were living in New Mexico. And Barbara and I were getting ready to get married. And this had gone on for, at that point, almost 4 years. From the time I resigned the church to the time I remarried. And Barbara had not been around my parents. He would have had nothing to do with us. Like, you know, he was struggling to have something to do with me. But the week before we got married, a pastor died, and in Fayetteville, and he had to come help with the funeral. So he flew over here, him and Mom. And they had a little apartment in a building they had built over in Lucama, which is behind where they live now. And I went by to see him. He asked, I'm pretty positive he asked me to come by. So I went by to see him. And in true dad fashion, it was his opportunity to say one last thing, right? But he said to me that day, he said, I want you to know I don't support what you're doing. He said, And of course, I already knew this. I didn't expect him to. It just so happened they happened to be in North Carolina at the time. It was just a few days before I got married, so it would have been the end of June of 2005. He said, I don't support what you're doing. He said, and I'm not coming to your wedding. And they didn't. He got that honest from his mom, because his mom didn't go to two of her daughters' weddings either. But he said, I'm not going to your wedding. He said, but if you get married, he said, family is more important than what I believe. And he said, so if you get married, I'm gonna lay it down, and you'll never hear it from me again. I'll never say anything about it again. And he said, we'll move on like nothing ever happened. And, we're 20 years removed from that now, and you'd never know it, right? If you saw all of us interacting, the way they treat me or Barbara and me, and or her boys or any of that. But he valued something higher than being right or wrong at that particular moment. And sometimes that's hard for us to do. He held out, right? He held out right to the last time he could. But he did what he said. He's never mentioned it again, ever, not one time. And I think sometimes we have to get over ourselves. That's a really hard thing. It's for even when we're right, we have to get over ourselves and to find the reconciliation.
Yes.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading in the 1 Year